Hey ecofictologists, welcome back to the channel. My name is Lovis and today I am welcoming back Mary Woodbury. I'm sure you're all as excited as I am to see her. Hi Mary.
Hi.
I invited Mary back to talk about something that she mentioned last time when I interviewed her, and that is the concept of ecological weird. So at the moment on the channel, I'm focusing on eco-fantasy in all its glorious forms, and ecological weird is one of those things that I don't know exactly where to place. And so I was researching it and I came across so many articles and they all seem to be written by Mary. So I just uh, I just thought instead of paraphrasing what she says, I could just invite her on here and she can tell you herself. So for those viewers who are here for the first time or who happen not to know about you and Dragonfly Eco, why don't you give a brief introduction to yourself?
Sure. I run dragonfly.eco, which has been around for over 8 years now. It's an exploration of world ecofiction. Ecofiction is much what it sounds like. It's fiction that's ecologically oriented or aware, uh, has nature, biology as a very strong part of it, whether it's advocacy or just great storytelling, which is what we prefer. Um, and I live in Nova Scotia with my husband and two cats. And some of my pastimes are dealing with 2.2 acres around us where we have planted trees and are kind of trying to keep a wilded area out back to attract deer and birds and pollinators and such.
Yeah, I heard a little bit about your rewilding project and I'm very, very jealous.
Yeah, I have to say we're not really rewilding that much. The previous owners didn't do much with that meadow, but they did mow it all the time, and we don't really mow it. We just kind of let it grow wild.
That's nice. I like that. You'll get lots of bees.
We got so many insects out there.
That's good. That's good. Okay, well, this episode about ecological weird is really what I want from it is to really learn from you about what the genre is, the category, whatever you want to call it. So we can just kind of dive right into it. So, Mary, what is ecological weird? Go.
Well, okay, so similar to ecofiction, eco weird fiction is weird fiction with ecological stuff happening in a big way, not just in the background, but up front. And when you do search on it, yeah, my name comes up a lot, but I've also discovered some great articles by the New York Times, by LA Review of Books, and LitHub that go into this a little bit more, especially when they're talking about novels or stories that appear in this fiction. And so, even though I don't really consider myself an expert, I have found that there's a lot more questions than answers, and also that there's weird fiction and new weird fiction. And there may be even, like I was telling you earlier, a new word or a next weird. I'm not sure about that. But from what I can get, the difference between weird fiction and new weird fiction is um, might have to do something with the past. Some of the earlier authors, such as Lovecraft, we're writing kind of like cosmic horror. And this is what I was just looking up, like what's the difference between this old weird fiction and the new, other than the new probably trying to move past some of the old fiction and also being called an urban fiction. Um, but cosmic horror is the fear and awe we feel when confronted by phenomena beyond our comprehension, whose scope extends beyond the narrow field of human affairs and boasts of cosmic significance. Whereas the new weird may deal more with nature horror rather than
Okay.
cosmic horror. So the new weird is probably because I think a lot of it takes place in the Anthropocene, um, it might be automatically more geared, even though it's called urban, it might be also geared toward the natural landscapes around us, which are changing quite a bit. But anyways, that might be the difference between the old weird and the new weird. Not saying that new weird ecological fiction is a thing. um, maybe. But anyways, I don't know if this is a recognized genre, but it is a concept that has been studied. And so if you do Google it, you can also find tons of like academic papers and theses, and people are studying this as a way to uh, see how fiction is can be described as ecological weird. So the ecological uncanny is another term that's been listed in research papers. Um, so yeah, I mean, we're if you think about weird fiction, we look at stories that are uncanny, absurd, surreal, and dreamlike. And one thing I thought of with the word absurd is that its Latin roots describe it as being out of tune. And my husband, he was linking me this song that was, I can't remember if it was only played in minor tones instead of major ones. And I'm like, he's like, but they're recognizable. And I said, no way, how could that be recognizable? And but I listened to the song and you can recognize it as just off.
Okay.
And so that's what I think now of weird fiction is that um, it's familiar, but it's just off. And it's not really off because of magic or anything like that. It's just off because the writer is writing it that way. So it's kind of on the edge. It's maybe something slipped away from reality. Weird fiction in the past has been supernatural or preternatural. But by supernatural, from what I understand, it's just the unknown. It doesn't necessarily mean ghosts and gothic things. So in LitHub, Elvia Wilk, who's the author of Oval, says the weird is an element of or zone or experience that is not completely explainable according to our current structures for categorizing the world. And yet it exists. We can come into contact with it, experience it, and try to describe it, knowing description will fall short. And she's had briefly talked about Margaret Atwood's short story, Death by Landscape, in which a girl is with her girlfriend and they're just out hiking in the woods and the girl disappears into the forest and just can't find her. Um, So she's talking about that, and she says, but the literal becoming plant that happens in these stories suggests the potential for agency and the willing dissolution of self. And I thought that was interesting because the girl and the story, we assume, doesn't just disappear. She actually turns into a tree.
Ooh.
Yeah. So she says weird knowledge does not deny the capacity of the human mind and body to produce knowledge, but it does not reduce the world to human subject experience either. Unlike science fiction, in which there is a rational explanation for everything, and fantasy, where magic explains it all, weirdness hovers between poles of explainability.
Ooh,
Um,
I like that.
yeah, so
I like that
I,
a lot.
I know. I mean, I think in weird fiction and ecological thought, there's a lot of otherness. There's a lot of maybe just us trying to figure out our changing world. Um, and I mentioned earlier the Anthropocene. If we think of it in the context of the Anthropocene, there's a lot of stuff going on there that Timothy Morton has talked about, including hyperobject, dark ecology, um, the age of symmetry, where we don't really understand everything that's going on. I mean, there's so much academic thought behind this that I can't go into because it's just so complex. But I think there's a lot of ideas behind ecological weird fiction that people can definitely uh, research and kind of go down that rabbit hole.
Okay, well, that actually leads me quite nicely into my next question because you mentioned that ecological weird sits kind of between sci-fi and fantasy. It's not magic, but it's also not really logical. So, would you still say that ecological weird is a type of eco fantasy, or do you think it's a separate thing? And I know you don't really like categorization that much. Um,
Right.
you're very conscious of othering anything, and
Mhm.
I completely respect that. But
Yeah.
if there were something that I could like look at a book and think, could this be ecological weird? What are those things that
Yeah.
would give it a feeling of ecological weird?
Yeah. I think with ecofiction itself, I'm is so inclusive with other categories of fiction because they all fit together. But with ecological weird or with weird fiction on its own, I think it is different than science fiction and fantasy, similar to something that I just said, where science fiction basically deals with something that is credible science. Uh, Fantasy usually deals with um, mythology or magic or folklore. Um, but weird fiction is a little bit different than those other two things. So I think it is separate. Although, like in the novella that I wrote, there was quite a bit of genre blurring, and I have read other weird fictions that bring in a little bit of uh, folklore. But I think that that's just, but the bulk of the story is not based on magic, or there's the explanation of it just doesn't usually exist in weird fiction. Maybe there's some hints at it. Science fiction and fantasy, you know what's going on, whether it's magic or just, experimental science that's based on reality but is kind of out there. Um, So, what fantasy and weird might have in common between them is a lack of plausibility in a story, but outside of that, fantasy often deals with magic or myth, whereas the weird is not so clear. Um, and it deals a lot with transformation, weird transmutation of things, which is where sometimes the ecological uncanny comes into play. A couple examples of this are in Jeff Vandermeer's Southern X trilogy. In Annihilation, there was a dolphin and it had a human eye. So I just think that that's maybe some biological transformation or evolution of this natural area of Area X. And then
Mhm.
another one is that in Rory Power's Wilder Girls,
Oh, I'm
people,
halfway through it and I'm completely hooked. It's so
yeah, it's
creepy. It's
awesome.
wonderful. It's
Yeah. But there's some weird things going on, like the
yes.
people they have this thing called the tox, which is a
Mhm.
disease, and their bodies actually take on it. It depends on whether they're male or female or just whatever, but they take on either animal or plant characteristics, sometimes both. Which is, and there's Rory. I've noticed that she nods a little bit to climate change in
Mhm.
her novel, so it's just a really unique way of addressing that, I think.
Yeah, well, yeah, I mean, I haven't finished it yet, so I don't have the
Mhm.
final explanation for why everything is happening. Um, but it feels, yeah, like this tox is trying to get humans to evolve, like to change, to be able to adapt to like a new circumstance. Um,
Yeah, this
and
is
it's really,
interesting.
oh, it's freaky. Oh, it's like
Yeah,
some things that are happening are giving me ugh, the shivers, but it's so good. I'm hooked
yeah.
completely. Um, but yeah, I mean, if that's so, those kind of examples, those are both earthbound. Do you think ecological weird has to be earthbound because it's kind of our ecology gone weird, or do you
Um,
think it could be like just an alien race in like a sci-fi fantasy book?
Um, I think it could be an alien race, because a lot of science fiction and fantasy does symbolize stuff that's going on in our world. It just kind of pads it in the background and make us, like we recognize it, but we're not looking directly at it, which
Hmm.
I think weird fiction does that too. Um, it's making us kind of look at our realities in a different perspective. Uh, there's Brad Tabas actually wrote a really good paper. Um, I don't remember the name of it. I can get it to you later, but he was talking about how ecological fiction takes our gaze above, kind of, we're looking at reality in a little bit different way, but it also brings it more into focus in a weird way.
Yeah, that's something that I find really powerful in, like, well, I mean, since I'm talking about eco fantasy recently, I'll use that as an example. I find that really powerful in, even secondary world fantasy,
Mm.
that you can reflect some of the struggles that we are seeing in a whole nother context, and it actually
Hmm.
becomes less confronting, and then people are more open to it. So if you look at
Yeah.
something from a different angle, then it's actually sometimes more effective than like smashing it into your reader's face.
Yeah. Yeah, that's exactly the point that I was trying to make. You said it so much better. But I think most of the weird fiction I've read is kind of based on the ecology of our own world, but not all. I mean, I think there's more science fiction-y kind of stuff sometimes happening.
Hmm. So have I just been reading Ecological Weird for years and didn't know what to call it? Like, are all kind of zombie stories ecological weird because it's about, it's some kind of virus or some kind of mutation or sickness that's happening that's changing people and changing the world as we know it. Does that count as ecological weird? I'm trying to find some kind of
Um,
boundaries.
I think it might. I think like in the past, there was a certain time when people just wanted horror stories. And, I think the difference between horror and weird is there's kind of a fine line there. But
Mhm,
part of that in our history has definitely been like zombies and ghosts and, people just want to be scared about stuff. But then things like zombies do take into consideration that there's some disease going on, and it um, kind of makes us step outside ourselves, or look at the other within us, or with zombies especially, maybe we all have something inside of us. Just take us a little bit out of ourselves, and, we become a zombie, whether it's based on a disease or something else. But, and there's some wonderful older classic uh, examples of weird fiction that are really ecologically based. Like the Willows, for instance, is this older classic story of these two men who are canoeing somewhere in Europe, and they come across this island where these willow trees are just, and all the biology on the island is just acting very strange. And they're, you know, that's a really favorite story of mine. And then Michael Bernanos is on the other side of the mountain. He did some wonderful uh, story tropes, I think, that I've actually seen later, maybe in a little bit of Jeff Vandermeer's stories and also Rory Powers, where trees will be genuflecting, but it looks like they're praying, or people have turned into, I don't know, they get petrified and they're just like statues. And so some of these earlier like zombie, stories and stuff like that might be considered ecological weird. Um, but I think some of the newer ones are, at least the authors might be more intending to say something about our world. And then the loss of environment that we're
Mhm,
experiencing right now.
mhm. Well, yeah, you gave a couple of examples there, and in looking through your articles, I noticed that a lot of the examples that you gave were from quite a long time ago.
Mhm.
And those two examples that you just gave were also from a little while ago, I think.
Mhm.
Um, are there modern? I mean, your own novella, as well as Jeff Vandermeer's Southern Reach series and Wilder Girls by Rory Powers. But are there other examples that are kind of more like in the last 20 years have been published?
Oh yeah, there's a lot. If you look at my website and just search for weird fiction, you'll find quite a few. Um, the problem is that I haven't included all of them. Well, my website's database is never exhaustive anyway because I
Even though
don't
it's
have the time.
huge, it's such a good
Yeah.
resource. It's massive.
It's just that I find a lot of weird fiction right now is occurring not in novel form, although there's definitely some which I can recommend. But a lot of it is in shorter novellas or short stories that actually appear somewhere else, like in an anthology. I haven't found any anthology that's specifically about ecological weird fiction. Not to say that it doesn't exist, it's just that I haven't really seen one. So a lot of these shorter stories aren't really listed on the website, and I've been meaning to forever to kind of put together a list of them or talk about them more. I'm currently reading and have been on and off reading Jeff and Vandermeer's The Weird Compendium, which is over 700 pages long and includes tons of short stories and even some smaller novellas that go back to classic weird fiction and up to the modern days. And I'm definitely finding some of the more modern ones, I'd say like since the 1990s, would fall into ecological weird fiction and just makes me feel good when I read them. But as far as novels and everything. We mentioned Jeff Vandermeer's The Southern Reach trilogy, Rory Powers' Wilder Girls. One that I just recently read was Christiane's Vadnais's Fauna, which is absolutely crazy and beautiful. Um, there's Karen Tidbat, Caitlin Kiernan are both short story writers for the most part, and you can find some of their stories in other anthologies. And I think that they're both very strong on landscape, the physical landscape around them kind of being a big part of the story. A novel is Samanta Schweblin's Fever Dream, which is just this weird long dialogue that is really interesting and is based on sickness that's caused by a contaminated stream. And I think that it's probably based on reality of where she lives in South America. China Meevil has written some short stories. Now, I know that he writes, I read once where he wants to write in every single genre that there is,
Oh.
but his his Three Moments of an Explosion is an excellent anthology of his own work. So he, has some stories in there that very directly speak to our modern world and climate change and the Anthropocene. However, I won't say maybe not so directly because, like other weird fiction, it's kind of out there and gives us that perspective. Rita Indiana's Tentacle is another novel. Um, I have an upcoming interview at Dragonfly actually on February 11th with Tluto Samahashi. Uh, she has this short story that we're going to talk about that's kind of weird, um, but it's very prose like. And then she has a new book coming out, and I'm not certain that she considers this weird fiction. She's definitely told me that she writes and her stories that reflect her experience with observations of climate change, killings of Black people, racism, gender-based violence, and the African diaspora, among other things. But I think some of what I've read, especially in the short story uh, that she wrote, takes on aspects of the weird. So those are just a few. I'm sure there's just tons more recommendations out there. Probably find more on my website if you search.
Definitely. Well, I will definitely link the website in the description, and people can have a whale of a time looking for ecological weird on there.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk a little bit about your novella that you published in November, Bird Song, under your pen name, Clara Hume? And you said you were inspired by some of this ecological weird to put that in your novel. You don't have to give anything away, but what kind of
Yeah.
aspects in your novel make it ecological weird?
Uh, well, first of all, I consider this novella more genre blurring than just a weird. It also does include some folklore and myth, such as it's kind of brings in the Greek sirens um, but writing it was mostly an experiment for me. It's There's something strange happening to Felsie, who's a young woman who's from Chicago, and she wakes up on this mysterious island where she meets the Greek sirens. Um, Part of that myth plays out, but the bigger part of the story is the island's flora and fauna, which is really unusual. So that's one aspect, kind of a trope that happens with ecological weird fiction. Um, and I've read some more classic weird fiction that includes either a charnel ground or a charnel house, which is a concept that makes sense in some different cultures, but in my story is tied with horror and weird events happening. But these in my story, they also symbolize a natural way of celebrating death and the cycle of life, but they're also from a horror perspective. So it's not exactly as, I don't know, wholesome as we want to think it is. Um, and I talked briefly about the genuflecting trees. I've noticed this in Rory Power's Wilder Girls, as well as Michael Bernanos's The Other Side of the Mountain. I gave a little bit of nod to that in my story. So there is some weird nature happening. I don't know if there's magic happening in my story, but there is like what we might consider something like time travel, but I don't really explain it. So too much. And so it is like weird fiction. You don't explain it. Where in science fiction, we kind of know maybe the technology explains the difference in the worlds, or in fantasy, magic usually would explain the difference or explain what's happening. But in my story, it doesn't seem plausible, but also things are not really explained, which is another concept or aspect, I guess, of weird fiction. Um, but the reality of the weird island and Thelsie's modern world, which she kind of goes back to in flashbacks, is just an allegory for how climate change had its roots long ago and is now upon us more than ever now. So, in a nutshell, that's what's going on
I like
in
it.
Birdsong.
Yeah, I'm also partway through that book, so I'm looking forward to all
Mm.
of these things. Yeah, well, that is the end of those are all the questions I have for you about ecological weird. Is there anything else
Okay.
you want to add? Anything that still comes to mind that people should know when thinking about ecological weird or wanting to write ecological weird?
I would say what I just briefly mentioned earlier is that there's so much out there that really goes more into some of the more complex thoughts surrounding ecological weird fiction. There seems to be a lot of papers written about it that dig a lot deeper than what I'm doing. So I would say for people just to maybe go into those, but there's also tons of stuff about weird and new weird fiction. Looking into articles about Jeff Vandermeer's The Southern Reach trilogy uh, has a lot of excellent uh, ideas, like New York Times, LA Review of Books, Lit Hub. I believe, a lot of more modern media has looked at this.
Okay, excellent. Well, people have resources, people have things to go and research if they want to delve deeper into ecological weird. I've
Mhm.
definitely, I don't know, there's something captivating, something fascinating about the ecology that we recognize just kind of slowly turning into an ecology that we don't recognize.
Yeah,
um,
exactly.
and it kind of taking on a life of its, I mean, obviously it has a life already, but
Hmm.
like a consciousness of its own
Yeah,
that yeah strays into the thriller suspense
yeah,
area for
yeah,
me.
yeah, that's true.
Definitely. Okay, well, thank you very much for joining me, Mary, and
Thank you.
thanks for talking to us about ecological weird.
All right, thank you for having me on again. I enjoyed it.
All right, well, I will see you next week, ecofictologists.